Growing up in and out of religious education, I was always taught that Jesus was born in a small town called Bethlehem in the famous nativity scene, and then grew up in a completely different village called Nazareth. That was presented as simple fact to me to the extent that I never really stopped to ask the simple question of why. Why, upon being told that she was pregnant, did Mary get on a donkey and go almost 100 kilometers to a completely different village, give birth, and then just go back home again? That is what we're going to be talking about today. Before we begin, two minor housekeeping points. One is that I am not currently a practicing Christian, nor do I adhere to any faith in particular. Two is that I will be approaching this video with the perspective of Jesus being a real historical person that actually lived and existed at one point, which is the view that's taken by most historians as of the making of this video. So let's set the scene. When Jesus was born, Judea was not an independent kingdom, nor was it completely under the control of the Roman Empire as it was when he died. It was something in between called a client kingdom. Now, client kingdoms were very common in imperial Rome, on frontier territories or places of particular cultural or political sensitivity, and at the time Judea was kind of both of them. Typically in a client kingdom, Rome would allow a local ruler to remain in charge to take care of things like taxes and policing, as long as they remained faithful to the empire. Now, in the case of Judea, the local ruler in question was a guy by the name of Herod the Great. Now, Herod's two main interests were grand-scale architecture and taxing people. So he wasn't Roman by blood, but he was definitely a man after the Roman heart. For the average person living in Judea at this point, Rome was always present, but often indirectly, so it would be through Herod or local government, or existing businesses and institutions that had kind of been sucked into the imperial wormhole. All of this matters because it sets the stage for the most common explanation typically given for why Jesus was born in Bethlehem. In the Gospel of Luke, we're told that Mary and Joseph travelled from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of a Roman census. Everyone, according to this account, was required to return to their ancestral hometown in order to be registered. In the Gospels of both Matthew and Luke, Joseph's bloodline traced distantly back to King David, who is someone who we will be talking about later, and David was born in Bethlehem, so that's where they went. So we look at this and we think, okay, Rome conducted censuses, Rome tried to uphold taxation wherever they went, and believe it or not, Rome would sometimes interfere directly in the lives of their subjects. But the problem is, when you look at this census explanation for more than like 10 seconds, it just starts to fall apart. Enter this guy, who for the sake of my own dignity will be referred to as Quirinius in this video. At the time of Jesus' birth, Quirinius was the Roman governor of Syria. The only historically attested census that fits the description given in the Gospel of Luke is the provincial census conducted by this guy Quirinius, which it's worth noting was not a census of the entire Roman Empire, which is what the Gospel of Luke said that it was. Now, this census is actually historically attested by other sources, and we know that it took place between 6 and 7 CE. And by this time, Herod the Great was dead, and Judea had been under Roman administration for about 10 years at this point. This places the census squarely outside the accepted historical time frame for Jesus' birth, which, contrary to the dating system, is actually probably somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC. Make that make sense. Even setting the dating thing aside, though, the mechanics of it just don't really make sense. Roman censuses were very practical and usually concerned who lived where, what property they owned, and how much tax could be extracted from them as a result. Forcing large numbers of people to abandon their homes and livelihoods and travel long distances, often across administrative boundaries, at best would have been expensive and counterproductive for the empire. Furthermore, there is no evidence anywhere in the Roman world that people were required to register in the towns of their ancestors, not least someone who literally lived 1,000 years before them. Rome counted households, lands, and labour where they actually existed, not where bloodlines pointed. So the census explanation just kind of ends up creating more problems than it solves. This in turn raises the next obvious question, which is, if the historical explanation doesn't make sense, then why Bethlehem? Well, by the 1st century, there was a widespread belief in Jewish tradition that the Messiah would come from the bloodline of King David. Now, outside of Jesus, David might be the single most important person in the Bible, period. The truest servant of Yahweh, the king of the Israelites with a blessed ancestry, and as far as the Second Temple was concerned, the ideal ruler. And also he was born in Bethlehem. This passage in the book of Micah is an explicit prophecy that talks about a future ruler emerging from the town of Bethlehem near Jerusalem. For audiences of the Gospels at the time who were already familiar with traditional Jewish scriptures, Bethlehem as a birthplace was like a credential. Nazareth had no such significance. It was a tiny farming hamlet in the middle of nowhere that wasn't connected to any prophecies, but it was where Jesus grew up, hence his title Jesus of Nazareth. So you have a problem. A figure whose public identity points to Nazareth, but whose role as the Son of God and the Saviour of mankind demands Bethlehem. The writers of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke resolve this problem by making Bethlehem his birthplace, even if only briefly, and then having him immediately after return to Nazareth, where his life and ministry can actually unfold. They provide different explanations for why this happened, but our main takeaway here is that Bethlehem was his birthplace because of extreme prophetic significance that had to be adhered to in writing when it happened. So this brings us to the last in a line of now a few obvious questions that I've asked in this video, which is, in the grand scheme of the Bible, not really. The place where Jesus was born doesn't affect the core of his teachings or the structure of the Gospels, or the claims that Christianity would later build around him. Bethlehem is a symbol rather than a hinge on which the entire narrative turns. And if you want me to be blunt, this kind of slip-up isn't uncommon in ancient historical texts. The writers of the Gospels weren't trying to satisfy standard historical methods for people 2,000 years into the future. Now, the discussion of Jesus' historical existence after he was born isn't really material for its own video, it's more like its own documentary miniseries. Like I said at the start, most historians now agree that Jesus was a real person, but constructing anything beyond that is always difficult and sometimes impossible. And that uncertainty is the reality of the ancient world. And so, annoying though it is, the Bethlehem issue doesn't really need to make sense in a modern documentary sense to be meaningful. It only needs to make sense within the framework that the authors were working in.